A storm of assumptions. Paul Kendrick stood at the polished glass doors of his restaurant, the Elysian table, scanning the interior with the critical eye of a man who demanded nothing but perfection. The soft amber lighting bounced off the crystal chandeliers, illuminating the pristine white tablecloths and the gold-plated utensils that adorned every table. His shoes clicked against the marble floors as he strode across the dining area, adjusting a wayward orchid on a centerpiece. "Emily," he called sharply, his tone cutting through the soft hum of preparations. A young waitress, flustered and hurried, appeared from the kitchen, clutching a tray of freshly polished wine glasses. "Yes, Mr. Kendrick. The wine menu is outdated. Make sure we highlight the Bordeaux collection for tonight. This is not a pub. This is refinement. Do you understand?" Paul didn't wait for her reply, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. Outside, the street bustled with life, the energy of the evening building as patrons filtered toward the upscale establishments lining the block. Paul peered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, his eyes narrowing as they fell upon an elderly black couple walking hand-in-hand toward his restaurant. The man wore a simple blazer, his tie slightly askew, while the woman's coat, though neat, bore the wear of time. Paul frowned. "Not my clientele." Walter and Elaine Bennett paused in front of the restaurant, its glowing facade promising a luxurious experience. Walter adjusted his tie, his expression calm but contemplative. "Doesn't this remind you of that place in Paris?" Elaine mused, her voice light. "It does," Walter agreed, his eyes scanning the decor through the window. "Let's see if the food lives up to the reputation." They stepped inside, greeted immediately by a hostess whose smile faltered momentarily before regaining its practiced warmth. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked, her fingers hovering over the reservation book. "No," Walter said, his tone polite but firm. "We were hoping you might have a table available." The hostess hesitated, her gaze darting to Paul, who had been watching from the bar. With a subtle wave, Paul approached, his smile as polished as the silverware. "Good evening," he greeted, his voice dripping with professional charm. "Paul Kendrick, owner. I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight." His eyes flitted to the empty tables in the dining area, their polished surfaces gleaming mockingly. Walter raised an eyebrow. "I see," he said, his voice neutral. "Are those tables reserved?" "They are," Paul replied smoothly. "We have a very particular clientele, you see, and I wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." Elaine's lips tightened, but her composure remained unbroken. "I understand," she said softly, though her gaze never left Paul's. Walter extended a hand to his wife. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Let's," Elaine replied, her tone carrying the grace of someone who had faced this before. As they exited, Paul's chest swelled with satisfaction. He had maintained the exclusivity of his restaurant, ensuring it stayed a haven for the affluent and sophisticated. First impressions matter, he thought, brushing his hands as if to cleanse himself of the encounter. Outside, Walter and Elaine walked quietly for a moment, their hands intertwined. Elaine broke the silence first. "I suppose we didn't fit the ambience," she remarked, her tone light but laced with underlying hurt. Walter's lips twitched into a wry smile. "It's not the first time, and it won't be the last, but it never ceases to disappoint." Elaine squeezed his hand. "Do you think we should have told him who we are?" "No," Walter said firmly, a spark of determination flickering in his eyes. "Sometimes people need to learn their lessons the hard way." They continued down the street, the city's energy swirling around them as they slipped into the folds of the crowd. To the passerby, they were just another elderly couple out for an evening stroll, their significance hidden beneath humble exteriors. But behind their quiet demeanor lay a story, a legacy that had transformed communities and reshaped lives. Back inside the Elysian table, Paul poured himself a glass of red wine, savoring the rich aroma. The evening progressed smoothly, the dining area filling with laughter, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. Patrons praised the menu, their compliments fueling Paul's ego. Another successful night. Paul mused as he closed the doors after the last guest left. But as he turned off the lights, his thoughts briefly wandered to the couple he had dismissed. He shook his head, dismissing the nagging sensation as unwarranted guilt. They wouldn't have appreciated the experience, he told himself, climbing into his luxury car. This place is for those who belong. Little did Paul know, the people he had turned away were about to show him just how wrong he had been. And the lesson they would teach him would change everything. A quiet force awakens. The Bennetts sat in their spacious living room later that evening, their modest yet elegant home glowing with the warmth of cherished memories. A grand piano stood in the corner, its keys untouched for years, yet its presence symbolized the harmony of their life together. Shelves of books and photographs filled the room, chronicling decades of shared adventures, challenges, and victories. Walter leaned back in his armchair, his fingers steepled as he reflected on the evening. Elaine, seated on the couch, stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The air between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. "It wasn't just us," Elaine finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but the undercurrent of resolve was unmistakable. Walter nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I know." Elaine continued, her words measured and deliberate. "How many others do you think have been turned away? People with talent, potential, or even just a simple desire to enjoy a nice meal." Walter exhaled, his gaze distant. "Too many, I'd wager." For most of their lives, Walter and Elaine had worked quietly, building their legacy through patience, perseverance, and a steadfast belief in fairness. Their investments had revitalized neighborhoods, funded scholarships, and provided opportunities for countless individuals overlooked by society. They had always operated in the background, preferring action over recognition. But tonight's incident stirred something deeper in them, a need to confront prejudice head-on. Elaine's eyes sparkled with determination as she turned to her husband. "Do you remember what you said when we started our first business?" Walter chuckled, a nostalgic smile softening his expression. "That it wasn't just about making money. It was about creating a space where everyone could thrive." Elaine nodded. "Exactly. And that's what we've done, time and time again." But tonight felt personal. Walter leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're thinking we should do something about Mr. Kendrick. I'm thinking we should do something for everyone like us who's been dismissed, judged, or overlooked because they didn't fit the ambience," Elaine said, her tone resolute. "And yes, that includes Mr. Kendrick. He may not know it yet, but he's about to learn a lesson he'll never forget." Walter's lips quirked into a half-smile. "You have a plan, don't you?" Elaine shrugged, her expression coy. "I have the beginnings of one, but it'll need your touch." Walter chuckled. "I'll always trust your instincts, my love. What do you have in mind?" Elaine leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Let's start by learning more about the Elysian Table, its staff, its operations, its reputation. If we're going to make a point, we need to be thorough." Over the next few days, Walter and Elaine quietly gathered information about the Elysian Table. They spoke with locals who had dined there, gathering a mix of glowing praise for the food and hushed murmurs of dissatisfaction about its exclusivity. Some staff members, feeling unseen and underappreciated, were willing to share their frustrations. "I've worked there for 3 years," confided Sarah, a server they met through mutual contacts. "The pay is decent, and the tips are great, but the atmosphere is suffocating. It's all about appearances. If you're not dressed to the nines or driving a luxury car, you're not welcome." Elaine listened intently, her expression empathetic. "Has it always been this way?" Sarah hesitated before nodding. "Paul Kendrick is obsessed with image. He wants the restaurant to be the pinnacle of sophistication. But sometimes it feels like he's more concerned with impressing investors than taking care of his guests or his staff." Walter leaned forward. "What about the staff? Does he treat you fairly?" Sarah glanced around nervously, as if Paul might appear at any moment. He's demanding. He expects perfection. Some days, it's manageable. Other days, it's exhausting. But she trailed off, her voice lowering. There are moments when you see who he really is. The way he talks to people he doesn't think are worth his time. It's like they're invisible. Walter and Elaine exchanged a glance, their suspicions confirmed. But this was only the beginning. The Bennett's investigation extended beyond conversations. Walter contacted an old friend in the hospitality industry, a consultant who specialized in evaluating restaurants. Together, they reviewed public records, financial statements, and customer reviews. The picture that emerged was consistent. The Elysian Table was profitable and well-regarded, but its growth had plateaued due to its rigid exclusivity. Paul Kendrick has created a bubble, the consultant observed during a meeting at the Bennett's home. He's cultivated an image that appeals to a specific demographic, but he's alienated potential customers and limited his market. If he wants to expand, he'll need to broaden his appeal. Elaine tapped her chin thoughtfully. And if he doesn't, he'll stagnate, the consultant replied matter-of-factly. Restaurants like his rely on repeat business and word of mouth. The moment his core clientele finds something new, he's done. Walter leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. So he's built a gilded cage. Beautiful, but unsustainable. Exactly, the consultant confirmed. Elaine smiled, her mind racing with possibilities. Thank you. You've given us exactly what we need. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. While walking through the city one afternoon, Walter and Elaine encountered a young chef named Liam who had once worked at the Elysian Table. Over coffee, he shared his experience. I left after 6 months, Liam admitted, stirring his cappuccino. Paul Kendrick is a brilliant businessman, but he doesn't see people, only numbers and appearances. It's a shame because the restaurant has potential. If he could learn to see beyond the surface. Elaine leaned forward, her gaze intense. What would it take to change his perspective? Liam considered the question carefully. He'd need to experience something profound. Something that forces him to confront his biases and realize what he's missing. Walter nodded slowly. Thank you, Liam. That's exactly what we needed to hear. That evening, Walter and Elaine sat down in their living room, a quiet determination settling over them. They had all the information they needed to move forward. Their plan was not about revenge or humiliation. It was about transformation. Paul Kendrick had made a mistake, but he wasn't beyond redemption. They would give him an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove that he was capable of change. Elaine's eyes met Walter's, a spark of excitement lighting her gaze. It's time. Walter smiled, the weight of their decision sitting comfortably on his shoulders. Let's make it happen. The Bennetts were ready to step out of the shadows, not for recognition, but to teach a lesson that would ripple far beyond the walls of one restaurant. Their quiet force was about to become impossible to ignore. A quiet force awakens, continued. The Bennetts wasted no time putting their plan into motion. The first step was to enlist the help of individuals who shared their vision. Walter reached out to his network of community leaders, business owners, and philanthropists. Each conversation followed the same script, a brief recounting of their experience at the Elysian Table, followed by a proposal to collaborate on a unique event. We want to show what inclusivity looks like, Walter explained during a phone call with a local nonprofit director. We believe that an open table can foster meaningful connections, and we'd like your help in creating that vision. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The director, a passionate advocate for equality, agreed immediately. Count me in, she said. This could be the start of something transformative. Meanwhile, Elaine took charge of organizing the logistics. She reached out to local artists, musicians, and chefs from diverse backgrounds, inviting them to showcase their talents at the event. Her warmth and sincerity won people over quickly. This isn't just about one restaurant, Elaine explained during a meeting with a group of young artists. It's about creating a platform where everyone feels seen and valued. The artists nodded, their excitement palpable. "We're in," one of them said. "Let's make this something they'll never forget." Walter and Elaine also decided to involve the staff at the Elysian table in their efforts. This part of the plan required finesse. They couldn't risk tipping off Paul Kendrick before the event was fully planned. Instead, they discreetly approached Sarah, the server they had met earlier, and asked for her help. Sarah was initially hesitant. "If Paul finds out I'm involved, it could cost me my job," she admitted. Elaine placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We understand the risk, and we won't ask you to do anything that compromises your position. But if you're willing, we believe you can help us create something truly impactful." After a moment's thought, Sarah nodded. "Okay, what do you need from me?" "Just keep us informed," Walter said. "If you notice any changes in Paul's behavior or hear him discussing future plans, let us know. It'll help us tailor the event to have the greatest impact." Sarah agreed, her resolve strengthening as she realized the potential for positive change. Over the following weeks, she provided the Bennetts with valuable insights into the inner workings of the Elysian table. As the pieces of the plan fell into place, Walter and Elaine began crafting the centerpiece of their initiative, a community dinner called the Open Table. The event would bring together people from all walks of life: business leaders, artists, activists, students, and everyday citizens. The goal was to demonstrate the power of inclusivity and challenge preconceived notions about who belonged in an upscale environment. The Bennetts chose a local venue known for its welcoming atmosphere to host the event. They worked tirelessly to transform the space into a vibrant celebration of diversity. Tables were set with mismatched but charming dishware. Centerpieces crafted by local artists adorned every surface, and the walls were lined with photographs capturing moments of unity and resilience. A curated menu featured dishes from around the world, each prepared by a different chef who brought their unique cultural perspective to the table. Live music filled the air, ranging from soulful jazz to energetic Latin beats. The atmosphere was one of warmth, joy, and connection. On the night of the event, Walter and Elaine stood at the entrance, greeting each guest personally. As the room filled with laughter and conversation, they felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the world they had always envisioned, a place where everyone felt they belonged. Midway through the evening, Walter took the stage to address the crowd. The room quieted as he began to speak. "Tonight, we've gathered to celebrate something simple yet profound. The power of community," Walter said, his voice steady and heartfelt. "Each of us comes from different backgrounds, with different stories to tell. And yet, when we sit at the same table, we discover how much we have in common." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This event is not just about food or art or music. It's about breaking down barriers and challenging the assumptions that keep us apart. It's about proving that an open table can change lives." The audience erupted into applause, the energy in the room electric. Elaine joined her husband on stage, her smile radiant. Together, they thanked the guests, the performers, the chefs, and everyone who had contributed to making the evening a success. As the event drew to a close, Walter and Elaine sat quietly at a corner table, watching the last of the guests linger over dessert and conversation. They felt a profound sense of fulfillment, but they knew their work wasn't done. "This is only the beginning," Elaine said, her voice soft but firm. Walter nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Now it's time to see if Mr. Kendrick is ready to learn." The Bennetts had laid the foundation for change. The next step was to bring the Elysian table into the fold on their terms, and whether Paul Kendrick realized it or not, his life was about to change forever. The invitation. The following morning, Paul Kendrick arrived at the Elysian table in his usual fashion, confident, impeccably dressed, and oblivious to the currents of change flowing around him. The staff bustled about, preparing for the day ahead, their movements precise and rehearsed. Paul's sharp eyes scanned the dining area, noting every detail. If even a single crystal on the chandelier was out of place, he would notice. He settled into his office with a fresh cup of coffee, savoring the moment of quiet before the day's challenges. As he sifted through emails, one subject line caught his attention. An opportunity to transform, from Walter and Elaine Bennett. Paul frowned. The names rang a faint bell, but he couldn't immediately place them. Intrigued, he opened the email. The message was succinct yet compelling. Subject: an opportunity to transform. Dear Mr. Kendrick, we had the pleasure of visiting your restaurant recently, and were impressed by its elegance and atmosphere. However, we believe there is an opportunity for growth that you may not have considered. We are hosting an event called The Open Table, and would like to extend a personal invitation to you and your staff. This event celebrates diversity and inclusivity in all forms, bringing together people from various walks of life to share stories, food, and culture. We understand that change can be challenging, but it is often through challenge that we find the greatest growth. We believe your restaurant could become a beacon of inclusivity while maintaining its reputation for excellence. Join us on Saturday evening to see what's possible. Warm regards, Walter and Elaine Bennett. Paul read the email twice, his brow furrowing as he reached the end. He set his coffee down, leaning back in his chair as he pondered the implications. The Bennetts were clearly trying to make a point, but what was their angle? Did they think he needed their help? He scoffed. I've built this place from the ground up, he muttered. I don't need a lecture on inclusivity. But something about the email nagged at him. Who were Walter and Elaine Bennett, and why did their names feel familiar? Paul did a quick online search, and his screen flooded with results. Profiles in business magazines, articles about philanthropic initiatives, and interviews highlighting their efforts to support underrepresented communities. His jaw tightened as he realized the truth. They were wealthy, influential, powerful, and he had turned them away. Paul leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He could still see Walter's calm, steady gaze and Elaine's composed smile as they left his restaurant. Now it all made sense. The realization stung his pride, but he quickly buried the feeling beneath a veneer of practicality. Well, they've extended an olive branch, he muttered. Might as well see what they're planning. That Saturday evening, Paul arrived at the address listed in the invitation. He parked his sleek black car and stepped out, adjusting his tailored jacket. The venue wasn't what he expected. Instead of a posh, upscale location, it was a spacious community center. Bright lights and colorful decorations adorned the entrance, and the faint sound of live music drifted out into the evening air. Paul hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The scene before him was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The room was alive with energy. People from every background mingled, laughing and sharing stories. Long tables were covered in vibrant tablecloths, and the aroma of diverse cuisines filled the air. Paul's eyes darted around the room, taking in the eclectic mix of guests. A woman in a wheelchair chatted animatedly with a group of teenagers. A man in a suit laughed with a young couple dressed in casual attire. At the center of it all stood Walter and Elaine Bennett, effortlessly commanding the room with their warmth and presence. Paul hesitated, suddenly feeling out of place. For all his confidence, this was unfamiliar territory. He was used to controlled environments where he dictated the rules. Here, the rules seemed to be rewritten entirely. Elaine spotted him first, her eyes lighting up with recognition. She nudged Walter, and together they approached him. Mr. Kendrick, Walter said, extending a hand. I'm glad you could join us. Paul accepted the handshake, his grip firm but his confidence faltering. Thank you for the invitation. This is quite the gathering. Elaine smiled. It is, isn't it? Every face here tells a story, and every story adds to the richness of the evening. That's what inclusivity is all about. Paul nodded, unsure of how to respond. Before he could say more, Elaine gestured toward a nearby table. Why don't you join us? I'd love for you to meet some of the incredible people who've contributed to this event. Paul followed them to the table, where he was introduced to a group of individuals whose accomplishments left him speechless. There was a chef who had overcome homelessness to open a successful restaurant, a musician who used her art to bring attention to social issues, and a young entrepreneur who had created a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. As Paul listened to their stories, a strange sensation began to stir within him. These were not the kind of people he would have considered inviting to the Elysian table, yet their passion, resilience, and creativity rivaled, if not surpassed, those of the wealthy patrons he catered to. Throughout the evening, Paul found himself drawn deeper into conversations that challenged his assumptions. He spoke with a teacher who shared stories of helping immigrant children find their voices through education. He met an artist whose work captured the struggles and triumphs of marginalized communities, and he listened to a retired nurse recount her efforts to provide health care to underserved populations. By the end of the night, Paul felt both inspired and unsettled. For years, he had defined success by exclusivity, believing that prestige came from catering to a select few. But tonight had shown him a different kind of success, one built on connection, authenticity, and the courage to embrace diversity. As the event wound down, Paul found himself alone with Walter and Elaine once more. This was eye-opening, he admitted, his usual arrogance tempered by genuine humility. Elaine smiled warmly. "That's all we hoped for, Mr. Kendrick. Sometimes the first step to change is simply seeing the world through a different lens." Walter placed a hand on Paul's shoulder. "The question is, what will you do with what you've learned tonight?" Paul didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, he felt a crack in the armor he had built around himself. And through that crack, a glimmer of possibility began to shine. Seeds of change. Paul Kendrick woke early the morning after the event, his mind still swimming with the faces, stories, and laughter of the night before. The vibrancy of the gathering was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if someone had pulled back a curtain and shown him a world that had been right in front of him, but one he had chosen not to see. Sitting in his sleek kitchen, the stainless steel appliances gleaming under the morning sunlight, Paul sipped his coffee and stared at his tablet. He couldn't focus on the usual news or market updates. Instead, his thoughts kept circling back to Walter and Elaine Bennett, and the pointed question Walter had asked him. What will you do with what you've learned? At the Elysian table, the day began as it always did. The staff hurried about, prepping for the evening service. Plates clattered, the hum of conversation filled the air, and the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen. But when Paul walked through the doors, the usual air of brisk efficiency was interrupted. Paul's demeanor was different. He wasn't his usual brisk, commanding self. Instead, there was a thoughtful stillness about him that the staff couldn't quite place. He gathered everyone in the dining area before the evening service. "Team," Paul began, his voice uncharacteristically steady. "I attended an event last night that made me rethink a lot about how we run this restaurant." The staff exchanged uncertain glances. Paul rarely addressed them in such a reflective tone. "I realized something important," he continued. "We've been so focused on creating exclusivity, on cultivating an image, that we've lost sight of something far more valuable: the stories and lives of the people who walk through our doors." The room was silent. Paul took a deep breath and pressed on. "I'm not saying we've been doing everything wrong," he clarified. "But I've been making decisions based on assumptions, judgments, and frankly, biases that don't reflect the values I want this restaurant to stand for." The changes didn't come easily, but Paul was determined to make them happen. The first thing he did was sit down with Mina, his manager, to review the restaurant's policies, everything from the reservation system to the dress code. "We need to stop turning people away based on how they look or whether they fit a certain image," Paul explained. "From now on, our focus is on welcoming anyone who appreciates good food and a memorable dining experience." Mina raised an eyebrow. "That's a pretty big shift, Paul. Are you sure we're ready for it?" "We have to be," Paul replied firmly. "If we don't change, we'll stagnate. Worse, we'll keep pushing away people who could bring something valuable to this place. Minna nodded, her skepticism tempered by curiosity. Okay, what's the plan? We're starting with the menu, Paul said. I want dishes that reflect the diversity of this city. Let's bring in guest chefs, try new flavors, and offer something that tells a story. In the following weeks, the Elysian table underwent a quiet but noticeable transformation. Paul reached out to some of the chefs he had met at the open table, inviting them to collaborate on new menu items. To his surprise, many of them agreed, intrigued by his willingness to step out of his comfort zone. Maria, one of the guest chefs, brought a dish inspired by her grandmother's recipes, a hearty stew made with spices and ingredients from her homeland. When it was added to the menu, it quickly became a favorite among diners. This is what food should do, Maria told Paul during a busy service. It should connect people, not separate them. Paul couldn't argue with that. But not everyone embraced the changes. Some of Paul's regular patrons bristled at the new direction, muttering complaints about how the restaurant was losing its refined edge. One evening, a longtime customer pulled Paul aside. "Paul," the man said, his tone condescending, "what's with all these new dishes? I came here for the classics, not experiments." Paul straightened his posture, meeting the man's gaze. "I understand your concerns," he said evenly. "But we're expanding our horizons, and I hope you'll give it a chance. If not, I understand that as well." The man huffed and walked away, leaving Paul with a pang of uncertainty. But he reminded himself of what Walter and Elaine had taught him. Growth often comes with discomfort. The staff also had their doubts. Sarah, the server who had previously confided in Walter and Elaine, approached Paul after a shift. "Can I be honest with you?" she asked. "Always," Paul replied. "I think what you're trying to do is great," Sarah began. "But it feels sudden. Some of us are struggling to keep up with all the changes." Paul nodded, appreciating her candor. "I get it. Change is hard. For me too. But if we're going to grow, we need to challenge ourselves. And I want us to do it together." Sarah smiled, her skepticism softening. "Okay, boss. Let's see where this goes." Despite the challenges, the restaurant began to attract a new clientele. Families, artists, and young professionals filled the tables, mingling with the old guard of upscale diners. The atmosphere became warmer, more inviting, and the stories shared around the tables added a richness to the experience that no amount of luxury could replicate. One evening, Walter and Elaine walked through the doors of the Elysian table. Paul recognized them immediately and hurried over to greet them. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "I'm so glad you're here." Walter smiled. "We've been watching from a distance. It seems you've been busy." "I have," Paul admitted, "and it's been challenging, but also rewarding. Thank you for giving me the push I didn't realize I needed." Elaine's eyes sparkled with approval. "The work is just beginning, Paul, but you're on the right path." That night, as Paul watched Walter and Elaine enjoy their meal, he felt a sense of pride that was different from the satisfaction he had once felt when catering to exclusivity. This pride came from knowing he was creating a space where everyone, regardless of their background, felt welcome. The seeds of change had been planted, and though the road ahead would be long, Paul knew it was worth every step. For the first time, the Elysian table was becoming something truly extraordinary, a place where stories were shared, barriers were broken, and the power of connection was celebrated. Seeds of change. As Paul watched Walter and Elaine enjoying their meal, he couldn't help but reflect on how far the restaurant had come in such a short time. Yet, the transformation felt incomplete. Deep down, Paul knew that this wasn't just about tweaking a menu or changing the clientele. It was about reshaping the culture of the Elysian table, from the way he led his team to how he treated every guest who walked through the door. Shifting the leadership dynamic. The next morning, Paul called an all-hands meeting in the restaurant's dining area. His staff sat in quiet anticipation, some curious about what new changes might be coming, others bracing for another whirlwind of directives. Paul stood before them, his posture less commanding than usual. There was a vulnerability in his demeanor that immediately caught their attention. "I want to start by thanking all of you," he began, his voice steady but tinged with humility. "I know the past few weeks have been a lot. New menus, new ideas, and for some of you, a new way of doing things. I also know I haven't always been the kind of leader who listens. That's going to change." A murmur rippled through the group, a mix of surprise and curiosity. Paul continued, his hands clasped in front of him. "This restaurant has always been about excellence," he said. "But what I've realized is that true excellence isn't about exclusivity. It's about creating something meaningful for everyone. Our guests, yes, but also for you, my team." Paul looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his staff. "So, starting today, I want to hear from you. What are we doing right? What's not working? And how can we make this place better, not just for our guests, but for all of us?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Sarah, the server who had cautiously supported Paul's changes, raised her hand. "Are you serious?" she asked, her tone skeptical but hopeful. "You actually want our input?" Paul nodded firmly. "Yes, Sarah. I mean it." Sarah glanced around at her colleagues before speaking again. "Okay. Then here's a start. We need more diversity in the team, not just in the menu. If we're going to represent the city, let's actually reflect it." Another voice chimed in. "Carlos, the sous chef. And can we update the training program? New hires are thrown into the deep end without much support. If we're building something new, we need to start from the ground up." Paul listened intently, jotting down notes as more staff members spoke up. By the end of the meeting, he had a long list of ideas, some ambitious, others straightforward, but all of them valuable. Building bridges in the community. Inspired by the success of the Open Table event, Paul decided to establish a monthly community night at the Elysian Table. These evenings would feature guest chefs, artists, and musicians from the local area, offering a platform for emerging talent while introducing his guests to new perspectives. To plan the first event, Paul reached out to Walter and Elaine. The couple agreed to meet him at the restaurant one afternoon, their presence filling the space with a quiet confidence. "I need your help," Paul admitted as they sat down in one of the corner booths. "I want to host a community night here, but I don't want it to feel forced or performative. How do I make it authentic?" Walter leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Authenticity comes from intent, Paul. Why do you want to do this?" Paul hesitated before answering. "Because I've realized that this restaurant has been missing something important: connection. I want to create a space where people from all walks of life can come together, not just to eat but to share stories, to learn from each other." Elaine smiled. "That's a good start. But remember, authenticity also comes from listening. Invite the people you want to connect with and ask them what they need. Let them shape the event with you." With their guidance, Paul began reaching out to local community leaders, inviting them to join the planning process. At first, he was met with skepticism. His reputation for exclusivity preceded him. But as he explained his vision and demonstrated his willingness to listen, the walls began to come down. One of the first people to agree to participate was Jamal, a chef who ran a small soul food kitchen on the other side of town. "I'll be honest, Paul," Jamal said during their first meeting. "I wasn't sure about this. But if you're serious about making room for everyone, I'm in." Jamal's enthusiasm proved contagious. Soon, a diverse group of collaborators came together, bringing their unique talents and ideas to the table. The event began to take shape, a celebration of food, art, and culture that promised to be unlike anything the Elysian Table had ever hosted. The first community night. On the night of the event, the restaurant was nearly unrecognizable. The usual pristine table settings were replaced with colorful tablecloths and centerpieces made by local artists. The walls were adorned with vibrant paintings, and a small stage had been set up in one corner for live performances. Guests arrived in a steady stream, their diversity reflecting the spirit of the evening. Families with children, young professionals, artists, and community leaders mingled freely, their laughter and conversation filling the space with an energy that was both electric and welcoming. Paul moved through the crowd, greeting guests and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He was struck by the contrast between this night and a typical evening at the Elysian table. The atmosphere was less formal, more alive, and far more meaningful. Midway through the evening, Jamal took the stage to introduce one of his dishes, a rich gumbo that had been passed down through generations in his family. As he spoke about the history and love poured into the recipe, the room fell silent, his words resonating deeply with everyone present. When the applause died down, Jamal turned to Paul. "And I've got to thank this guy," he said, gesturing toward him, "for opening his doors and his mind. Here's to more nights like this." Paul felt a lump in his throat as the room erupted into cheers. For the first time, he understood what Walter and Elaine had been trying to show him. Success wasn't just about prestige or profit, it was about creating something that mattered. A new chapter. By the end of the night, Paul stood near the entrance, watching as the last guests trickled out. Walter and Elaine approached him, their smiles warm and approving. "You've come a long way," Elaine said. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Paul nodded, his heart full. "I know, and I'm ready." As they said their goodbyes, Paul turned back to the empty dining room. It no longer felt like a monument to exclusivity, but a canvas for connection, growth, and endless possibilities. For the first time in his career, Paul felt truly proud, not of what he had built, but of what he was building. And he knew, without a doubt, that the Elysian table's best days were yet to come. Transformation under fire. The first community night at the Elysian table had been an unqualified success. The reviews flooded in from guests, many of whom had never set foot in the restaurant before. Social media buzzed with posts about the event, filled with photos of smiling faces, colorful dishes, and heartfelt captions. For the first time, Paul Kendrick felt his restaurant was more than just a business. It was becoming a place where people gathered to connect and celebrate their shared humanity. Transformation under fire. The first community night at the Elysian table had been an unqualified success. The reviews flooded in from guests, many of whom had never set foot in the restaurant before. Social media buzzed with posts about the event, filled with photos of smiling faces, colorful dishes, and heartfelt captions. For the first time, Paul Kendrick felt his restaurant was more than just a business. It was becoming a place where people gathered to connect and celebrate their shared humanity. But not everyone was pleased. The backlash. Within days of the event, Paul began receiving complaints from some of his longtime patrons. The phone at the restaurant rang constantly with calls from upset regulars. The emails poured in, filled with phrases like "lost its charm," "not what we expected," and "trying too hard to appeal to everyone." One particularly scathing message came from a wealthy client who had frequented the Elysian table since its opening. "Paul," it read, "you've turned your restaurant into a circus. The exclusivity and refinement that made your place special are gone. If you want to cater to the masses, go ahead, but don't expect people like me to stick around." Paul stared at the email, his stomach tightening. He had anticipated some resistance, but the vitriol in the messages stung more than he cared to admit. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he ruining everything he had worked so hard to build? Standing firm. That evening, Paul called a meeting with his leadership team. Mina, his manager, and Carlos, his sous chef, joined him in the office, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Paul began, holding up his phone. "We've been getting complaints from some of our regulars about the new direction." Carlos shrugged. "We knew this was going to happen, boss. People don't like change." "True," Mina added, "but this isn't just about them. The community night was a success. We've attracted new patrons who love what we're doing. Isn't that worth the pushback?" Paul leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "It is," he admitted, "but we can't ignore the fact that we're losing some of our core clientele. The question is, how do we balance the old with the new?" Carlos leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe we don't try to balance it. Maybe we lean into what's working. If the old crowd wants to leave, let them. We're building something better." Minna nodded. "Agreed. But we also need to communicate what we're doing more clearly. Some of the complaints are coming from people who think we've abandoned everything they loved about the restaurant. If we show them that we're not sacrificing quality, just expanding our vision, we might win some of them back." Paul's gaze shifted between the two of them. Their words resonated, but he couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at the edges of his confidence. Still, he knew they were right. The success of the Elysian Table's transformation depended on staying true to the new path while ensuring its foundations remained strong. A bold move. Determined to address the backlash head-on, Paul decided to hold a second event, this one specifically for the restaurant's longtime patrons. He called it the Elysian Experience. Past meets future. The idea was to showcase the evolution of the restaurant by blending its classic dishes with new creations inspired by the community night. Paul reached out to Walter and Elaine Bennett for advice. As always, they were eager to help. "Your challenge," Walter said during a meeting in the restaurant, "is to show your regulars that change doesn't mean losing what they love. It means enhancing it." Elaine added, "And don't forget to share your story. Let them know why you're making these changes. People resist what they don't understand, but if they see your heart in it, they might just come around." Inspired by their wisdom, Paul threw himself into planning the event. He worked closely with Carlos and the kitchen team to create a menu that honored the restaurant's roots while embracing its new direction. Signature dishes like the herb-crusted lamb and the rich truffle risotto were paired with bold new creations like Maria's family stew and Jamal's gumbo. Paul also decided to give a speech during the event, a move that made him uneasy but felt necessary. He spent hours crafting his words, rehearsing in front of the mirror until he felt confident he could deliver them without faltering. The night of the Elysian Experience. The restaurant was packed. The usual quiet elegance of the Elysian Table had been replaced by a lively buzz as familiar faces mingled with new ones. Paul stood near the bar, greeting guests as they arrived. Many of his regulars approached him with guarded expressions, their skepticism evident. "This better be worth it, Paul," one man muttered as he shook his hand. Paul forced a smile, his nerves jangling. "I think you'll be pleasantly surprised." As the evening unfolded, the tension in the room began to ease. Guests marveled at the dishes, their initial reluctance melting away with each bite. The blend of old and new flavors sparked conversations that cut across age, background, and expectations. At the halfway point, Paul took the stage. The room quieted as he stood under the soft glow of the chandeliers. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "For years, the Elysian Table has been my pride and joy, a place where I could share my passion for food and hospitality. But over time, I realized something was missing. We were serving dishes, but we weren't serving stories. We were creating an atmosphere, but we weren't creating connection." He paused, scanning the room. "Recently, I had the privilege of attending an event that opened my eyes to what this restaurant could become. It showed me that exclusivity isn't the same as excellence, and that the real magic of a dining experience comes from the people who share it." Paul's voice grew firmer as he continued. "Tonight's menu reflects our journey, honoring the traditions that brought us here while embracing the diversity that makes our future so bright. I hope you'll join us in this new chapter, where every story, every flavor, and every person is welcome." The room erupted into applause, and Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him. As he stepped off the stage, Walter and Elaine caught his eye from across the room, their expressions filled with pride. The turning point. By the end of the evening, many of the skeptics had been won over. A regular customer approached Paul as the event wound down. "I wasn't sure about all this," she admitted. "But tonight reminded me why I fell in love with this place. You've taken something great and made it even better." Paul smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Thank you. That means a lot." As the last guests departed, Paul stood in the center of the dining room, taking in the scene. The Elysian Table was no longer just a restaurant. It was a place where worlds collided, where stories were shared, and where every guest, old and new, could find something to savor. Paul knew there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt confident that he was on the right path. The transformation of the Elysian Table wasn't just about changing the way people dined. It was about changing the way they connected. And that, Paul realized, was the true measure of success, a legacy forged in connection. Months after the initial transformation began, the Elysian Table had become more than just a restaurant. It had grown into a symbol of inclusivity, creativity, and community. While the changes weren't without their challenges, the restaurant's new identity was solidifying. For the first time in years, Paul Kendrick felt a profound sense of purpose, not just as a business owner, but as a human being. The ripple effect. The buzz surrounding the Elysian Table's transformation spread far beyond its walls. Local news outlets covered the community nights, praising the restaurant's commitment to bridging divides. Food critics who once lauded the restaurant's exclusivity now celebrated its innovation and heart. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected places. Paul began receiving letters from people who had attended the community nights, many of whom shared how the experience had impacted them. One letter stood out. It came from a young woman named Maya, a single mother who had attended one of the community events with her son. "Dear Mr. Kendrick, I wanted to thank you for creating a space like the Elysian Table. My son and I attended one of your community nights, and it was the first time I felt truly seen in a long time. Sitting at a table with people from all walks of life, sharing stories and laughter, it reminded me that I'm not alone. My son still talks about the food and the music, and he's even inspired to try cooking. You've given us a memory we'll cherish forever. Thank you for opening your doors and your heart. With gratitude, Maya." Paul read the letter twice, the words striking a chord deep within him. It wasn't just about the food or the events. It was about the connections they fostered. For years, he had focused on crafting the perfect dining experience, yet he realized now that perfection wasn't about pristine table settings or a flawless menu. It was about creating a space where people felt they belonged. The next step. While the Elysian Table had evolved, Paul knew that real change required ongoing effort. During a quiet evening at the restaurant, he sat down with his leadership team, Minna, Carlos, and Sarah, to discuss the future. "I don't want this to be a one-time transformation," Paul said, his voice firm. "We've done great things so far, but we can't stop here. I want this restaurant to be a model for others, a place where the values we've embraced become the standard, not the exception." Minna leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "What are you thinking?" "I want to expand," Paul replied. His words met with a ripple of surprise, but not the way we originally planned. "I don't want to replicate the Elysian Table as it was. I want to create spaces like this in other communities, each one unique, each one reflective of the people it serves." Carlos grinned. "You're talking about building restaurants that are about more than just food." "Exactly," Paul said. "Each location will partner with local artists, chefs, and musicians. We'll host community events, fund scholarships, and find ways to give back. This isn't just about running a business anymore. It's about leaving a legacy." The Bennett's blessing. Paul knew he couldn't move forward without consulting Walter and Elaine Bennett. Over the months, they had become more than advisors. They were mentors, guiding him with their wisdom and unwavering belief in his potential. The Bennetts arrived at the Elysian Table for a private dinner. Paul greeted them warmly, leading them to a quiet corner table. The three sat together, the evening's ambience humming softly around them. I've been thinking about what you said months ago, Paul began, his tone thoughtful, about how success is measured by the connections we create, not the exclusivity we cultivate. Elaine smiled. It seems you've taken that lesson to heart. I have, Paul admitted. And now, I want to take it further. I want to expand, but in a way that amplifies what we've built here. I want to open new locations that celebrate the diversity of their communities, that bring people together the way we've done here. And I was hoping, no, I was praying, that you'd be willing to guide me. Walter leaned back in his chair, studying Paul with a steady gaze. Expansion is a big step, he said. It's risky, and it requires more than just a vision. It requires trust, commitment, and humility. I'm ready, Paul said earnestly. I've learned so much these past months, but I know I still have a long way to go. That's why I need your help. Walter exchanged a glance with Elaine, who nodded. We'll help you, Walter said. But on one condition. Paul straightened in his chair. Anything. You have to promise, Walter continued, that you'll never lose sight of why you're doing this. The minute it becomes about profit over people, you'll have lost everything you've worked to build. Paul nodded, his voice steady. I promise. A grand opening. A year later, the first expansion of the Elysian Table opened in a bustling neighborhood across town. The restaurant was a collaboration between Paul and the local community, featuring artwork from neighborhood artists, a menu crafted by a diverse team of chefs, and a stage for live performances by local musicians. The grand opening was a celebration unlike any other. Walter and Elaine Bennett were guests of honor, their presence a testament to the journey Paul had taken. As the evening unfolded, Paul took the stage to address the crowd. When I first started this journey, I thought success was about creating exclusivity, he said, his voice carrying across the room. But I was wrong. Success is about creating spaces where everyone feels they belong. It's about breaking bread with strangers and walking away as friends. Tonight, we celebrate not just a restaurant, but a vision of connection, compassion, and community. The crowd erupted into applause, and Paul felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had come full circle, but this was just the beginning, a legacy in the making. As the night wound down, Paul found Walter and Elaine sitting quietly at a table, observing the lively scene around them. He approached, pulling up a chair. I couldn't have done this without you, Paul said, his voice filled with gratitude. Elaine reached over, placing a hand on his. You always had it in you, Paul. You just needed to see it. Walter nodded. And now it's your turn to guide others. Paul smiled, the weight of their words settling comfortably on his shoulders. The transformation of the Elysian Table wasn't just about one restaurant. It was about creating a legacy of inclusivity and connection that would ripple outward for years to come. As he looked around the room, filled with laughter, stories, and shared meals, Paul knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. And in that moment, he understood that success wasn't just something you achieved. It was something you shared.